Port Elizabeth began as a fort. In 1799, hostilities with France made Britain anxious about her sea routes to the east, so Fort Frederick was built to guard the southeast coast of Africa. Then came the 1820 settlers. Britain enticed 4,000 immigrants to the Cape to ease unemployment at home after the Napoleonic Wars, and also to act as a human buffer along the eastern frontier, which was under pressure from migrating African tribes. Port Elizabeth was named in 1820 after the late wife of Sir Ruthven Donkin, acting governor of the Cape, and the pyramid he erected in her memory still stands in the Donkin Reserve. Just over a century later, on the site of the first landings, the Campanile was built to commemorate the early settlers. By the 1890s, Port Elizabeth was a major commercial centre and a bustling maritime town. The Eastern Cape as a whole was already well served with a railway network, and by the turn of the century, harbour facilities were developing steadily. Port Elizabeth, it could be said, was becoming well connected. But what of the undeveloped hinterland to the west, the fertile but still isolated Longkloof Valley? The land here had great potential, but farmers were still reliant upon the painfully slow ox wagon to get their produce to market and were locked into a pattern of subsistence. They began to clamour for a railway. When engineers first contemplated the building of a railway here, they were confronted with this: a land broken by rivers, mountains, and precipitous gorges. To serve the whole agricultural district effectively, the railway would need to extend from Port Elizabeth through the entire length of the Longkloof to Avontuur, a distance of nearly 300 kilometres. In such terrain, it was going to cost a fortune. In 1898, a survey put the estimated cost of this railway, built to South Africa's standard gauge of 3 foot 6 inches, at over £6,000 per mile. However, engineers claimed that the cost would be reduced to only a third of that by placing the rails just 24 inches apart. A narrow-gauge railway saves on the cost of earthworks, finding its own way through the existing terrain and snaking along the natural contours of the land, rather than across a man-made landscape of bridges and cuttings. Bridges for the standard gauge would have totaled 79 in number. For the narrow gauge, only a third of those were deemed necessary. So the decision was taken. The Avontuur Railway would be built to the narrow gauge. Such earthworks as were required for the 2-foot gauge line were begun in 1902, and by the end of that year, 3 construction engines had arrived, and the Cape Government Railway's latest project was well underway. The entire labour force numbered only 100 men. Construction gangs were small, and the locomotives even smaller. Perhaps the best known was a little tank engine affectionately named Midget, which, according to her crew, could turn on a right-angled bend. Although sharp curves and steep grades indeed prevailed, the Avontuur line nonetheless followed many of the specifications of a 3 foot 6 inch gauge railway, with bridges that could be upgraded to the broader gauge if that were ever to be found necessary. An important first question was where to locate the main station and depot at the Port Elizabeth end of the line. The city always has been short of space, packed onto a narrow foreshore, hemmed in by a sudden rise to higher ground further inland. The site selected was the Humewood area south of town. This had good access to the hinterland, but as there was no room for the new depot down at dock level, it finally found itself perched on a ledge 20 metres above the harbour. This problem was solved by the construction of a long straight trestle, and the essential link between depot and dock was thus established. The gradient of this trestle was 1 in 40. On the seaward side was the drop to the harbour. On the landward side was the road to Humewood, and from this the depot took its name, Humewood Road. The main station was situated here, as well as a complete locomotive depot and extensive facilities for carriage and wagon repairs. Over the years, it became an increasingly busy place and saw decades of active steam service. In April 1903, the indomitable Midget was given the honour of taking the very first passengers out of Humewood Road on a trial trip down the line. These were the intrepid Port Elizabeth citizens who made that first journey. By Christmas of that year, the tracks which led out of town had reached well into the farming hinterland they were intended to serve. The terminus of the line was at Gedolt River, and weekend parties of curious sightseers were now riding the trains. But just 8 kilometres further on, the Avontuur railway was to confront its first major obstacle. Van Stadens River Gorge is a chasm sliced through the living rock by the force of water obeying gravity. The railway bridge across it is a spindly-looking structure dwarfed by the landscape that embraces it. But for its time, it was an impressive feat of civil engineering. Perched on 5 steel towers, it stood 78 metres above the water level. It was designed by Alan Grant Dalton, and work on it began in early 1904. This continued for 14 months, with most of the construction material brought in on the already completed stretch of railway from Port Elizabeth. The Van Stadens River Bridge was highly regarded by the civil engineering fraternity of the day for its economy of construction. Given its strength and capabilities, it was a lightweight structure, nearly 200 metres long, but with a total weight of steel running to less than 600 tons. Even so, the bridge added greatly to the overall cost of the line.